for getting this loaded up. Thank you, Marlene, and everyone here at George Washington for having me again. I was just here a couple of weeks ago to talk for, I got to talk for a long time, that time about particularly ISIS and jihadist recruiting to Syria. And so partly because I just talked a lot about that, but also because there are a lot of other things that I see in the research. I'm going to talk a little bit less about that today, actually, and talk about some other extremist movements and the general ways that extremist movements use social media. And of course, we'll talk about ISIS and other jihadist movements too. But I want to start today talking about this video that was released recently. It just got more public attention again in January. It was released at some point in the fall of last year by someone, one of the policemen who was involved in a raid in a home in Tashkent. It's not clear how they were tipped off or why it was that they were doing the raid, but the video begins, one of the police officers just filming it on his cell phone camera. It's pretty shaky. But a group of, a mix of undercover and uniformed officers come into this apartment where there's one man or woman who's a transvestite dressed in women's lingerie, and then other men who are accompanying them. And the police, for the 5 minutes or so that this video goes on, are just openly abusive towards the people who are in this apartment. At one point in the video, the woman, we'll call her, is begging the policemen who are interrogating her, please don't show this video, please don't tell my family, I have a family they don't know, please don't tell anyone about this. And in response, the undercover police officer kicks him in the face. And this video was released by one of the police to boast about the raid, actually. And eventually, it drew the attention of a new Uzbek news website called El2s, and it was posted, they posted a story about it originally and then posted a follow-up story that saying that after the video had been released and gathered attention on social media with their critical interpretation of it, that these officers who were involved in the raid had been disciplined. Both of them, one of them had been fired and each of them had been busted down a rank. And this was posted in one of the freest of all the Uzbek social media groups. It's a group on Facebook called Kurkmaymiz that's designed by Uzbek activists who are living abroad to create a free space where they can interact with other Uzbeks who are at home. And it's meant to be, the purpose of the article was you know, on contrary to the officers who posted originally, for the news website to be able to say, look, we did this, we exposed this, and we've done something really positive, particularly for the people who are abused in this video. And it's on probably the most liberal Uzbek language media forum that you could find, but that includes people from inside and outside the country. And the response in the comments that follow was very different than what the posters had intended. It was overwhelmingly negative. So we have people saying this was good, it was the right thing to do. What are you supposed to do with those its, using the Russian pronoun? Someone says that the first time I've ever felt bad for a cop because they were disciplined for abusing this transvestite woman. I'm against all homos, I don't support Iran and ISIS, but if they kill gays, I support that. The punishment for gays and lesbians is death. That's right, death to pedos. Pidorum is this incredibly nasty Russian slang word that's all over the internet. And even though these people are discussing it from Uzbekistan for the most part in Uzbek, it's really interesting that the language, these really pejorative terms that they use are all Russian. And we'll come back to that in a moment. So this is a really interesting example of the way on social media in particular, no matter what the intentions are, a network, a community can come together and often reverse the meaning of the thing that was presented. In this case, we're supposed to see that justice has been done, and these police officers who were abusing someone, abusing an innocent victim, or even though, although this is against the law in Uzbekistan, but certainly it doesn't allow them to kick or punch or publicly humiliate people. But the community in receiving this reversed the victimization and made the police the victims instead of the transvestite woman who was being beaten. And this is a theme that we're going to see happen over and over and over again. It's also a symbol of, it also signifies the way that we're increasingly seeing violence propagated on social media. Actually, if you look at the, when you link to this video, although the video that Jews had published had the faces masked out of it in order to protect the privacy of the people who were being abused, the next link that YouTube provides is an unmasked version of this video where the young man's family is able to see this and see him humiliated, and everyone who knows him can see him publicly humiliated on YouTube, because there is, as it turns out, a very large movement inside Uzbekistan to humiliate transvestites online. There's a tag for this, they're called Dilshod, which is just a male name in Uzbek, and it's unclear why Dilshod became this hashtag for transvestites. But if you type Dilshod into YouTube, you'll see dozens of videos like this. Many of them are just shockingly violent and pretty disturbing, where young men will just be walking around in the street, they'll see either a woman who looks a bit manly, or they'll see a man who they believed is dressed in women's clothing, and they'll first begin verbally assaulting them, and a lot of times in these videos, passersby will try to intervene, they'll try to get the guys to back off, try to get them to calm down, and it doesn't work. Eventually they'll go pursue, and in each of these videos, a few minutes into it, they just begin beating the woman and do so mercilessly. And these videos actually draw a huge number of views. The most famous of them has been viewed more than 500,000 times, which is really huge numbers for Uzbek social media. And it's a really good example of the way that on social media, the ugliest and the loudest things are the ones that draw attention. And in fact, many of these videos are promoted by sort of quasi-media outlets, like this one is just called Uzbek Shock Video, where they make money by selling advertising on YouTube by just putting stuff out there that will get clicks. And this kind of violence is something that will get clicks. And so they'll post multiple of these videos, or other sort of domestic abuse, other types of violence like this. It's a really good example, unfortunately, of the way that social media channels discourse into these violent directions. And so when we talk about violence and violent mobilization on social media, we spend most of our time for Central Asia talking about jihadist groups. And this is what we know. These are the ones that are visible, and actually their tactics on social media are driven by this same thing, because they know that the louder you shout, the more violent and the more obscene and the more shocking and offensive the videos are, the more attention that they'll get and the more that they'll be shared. And so social media itself, and this flattening of the media environment and social media that sort of demands that you shout in order to be heard, drives that even for the jihadist groups. But jihadist groups are actually one of only 3 larger movements in Central Asia that are mobilizing violence at present and using social media to do this. So these are Uzbeks fighting in ISIS in Iraq on the top right. On the left here is a young man named Yuri Kofner, who runs a Eurasianist group linked to Alexander Dugin. He believes that he calls himself sort of Dugin light, Dugin but less fascist, he says, as he holds an automatic weapon. And then at the bottom we have ultra-nationalist and vigilante groups. This is Kyrgyzstan in Kyrgyzstan. And so what I'm going to argue is that all of these groups together participate in this intensification of violent discourse on social media, and this kind of, they add this vulgarity to the discourse that happens on social media that normalizes violence. And each of them participates in almost exactly the same way. So Kaufner's group is called the New Eurasia or Молодая Eurasia, and he's a bizarre, probably an insane person. Actually, he's this hipster polyglot who takes everything from American pop culture, but then turns it around and makes it about Russia and Slavic groups and things like that. He's very good at targeting Central Asians and Muslims who live in Eurasia by putting on this sort of friendly, sort of new Soviet Union face where you emphasize Eurasian heritage, but behind the scenes he's working together with Slavic white power groups and things like that, and mobilizing violence. In 2014 and 2015, they were openly gathering people, offering military training, free military training outside Moscow, for people to go and learn how to use weapons and go fight in militia groups in Ukraine. So this is happening openly, and this group has chapters in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, and he travels to the region pretty frequently. And talks to young people. They organize reading circles, and then they mobilize people to go learn how to shoot guns and kill people in Ukraine. The nationalist groups like Kirk-Charo are ones that have been covered quite a bit in other media. EurasiaNet actually covers these guys pretty well. And this is a familiar refrain inside Central Asia. I can't say often enough that there's been more violence done in areas like the Fergana Valley in the name of ethno-nationalism and by ethno-nationalist mobilizations than there has by Islamists, by a factor of many, 10 or 20, something like that. There have been hundreds of people killed in the Fergana Valley in ethno-nationalist violence in the last 20 years, and maybe a few dozen by Islamists. These groups within Kyrgyzstan in particular target they target gay rights groups, they target homosexuals in public. This is an example of them, a pretty well-known raid that they did on a gay rights protest in Bishkek last year. They also will conduct raids on restaurants and nightclubs and round up Kyrgyz girls that they say are prostituting themselves to Chinese businessmen and things like that. There's no legal justification for doing this. There's no evidence that this is happening. This is a vigilante group that operates with impunity. And then inspired by these kind of groups, there are many, many cases that are done by people who are not members of any particular group, but will harass women in Russia or Turkey or elsewhere for misogynation, basically. There's no real nicer way or more politically correct way of putting this. They will harass and sometimes beat women for being associated with men who are not Uzbeks or not Kyrgyz or not Tajiks. They'll do this in public, and then they'll post about it online and post sometimes videos of themselves beating these women. And they get hundreds of thousands of views. And while many of the reactions are negative, on the other hand, they do a lot to sort of normalize this type of violence and make it seem like something that happens probably more often than it actually does, but then that has the self-fulfilling prophecy effect of by normalizing it, allowing it to happen more often. These groups, all of them, in fact, all extremist groups on social media have a lot more in common than they have different, no matter how different their ideologies are. One of the most basic approaches that they do is to construct this victim identity. And most often they do this by reversing victimization directly. Sometimes they do it just by making things up. These are examples of lots of photos that were used by jihadist groups in the last couple of years. Often they're not directly tied to jihadist groups, but they're meant to intensify this idea among Central Asian Muslims that as a Muslim, you are a victim and you're going to be victimized, and other Muslims like you are being victimized in other places. So these are all supposed to be photographs from Burma, This is supposed to be a Buddhist monk tossing the body of a Muslim baby on a fire, and all kinds of other really awful graphic things. The problem with all of these photographs on the right is that they're all fake. They're either from other places other than Burma, or that they aren't real. They're from films or from something else. But these are passed around on social media in order to cause people to identify not just with other Muslims, but identify themselves as victims, and then to participate in violent acts after this, in defense of us. There's a lot of work that gets done in educating people in Central Asia that they are Sunnis and not Shias and not Jews, and that of course you should understand that there's an alliance between the Shias and the Jews against you. Similar type of thing. There's a lot of work that's done by Salafi groups, and then jihadist groups will piggyback onto this, that try to convince Muslims to stop celebrating Christmas, stop celebrating holidays that are from the West, and that this is something that you need to fight against. That this is a sense where you're being victimized, even by Santa Claus. A key portion of ISIS recruiting is that the United States is responsible for all of your problems, and if you join ISIS, you're going to fight the United States. This came particularly home with the videos produced by Goldberg Lima last year. He had undergone special forces training inside the United States. He's one of the Tajik elite, but he fashioned himself as a victim and said he was a victim of the United States, and claimed that when he was in the United States, he learned about how the US Army plans to attack Muslims, and that he was personally offended by this when he was there. He actually claims that he trained at the Blackwater training camp, this sort of thing. None of it really makes very much sense, but people believe it uncritically. The groups that are active with these sort of Russian fascist groups are directly connected a lot of times to Alexander Dugin up in the upper left-hand side, but these are the same sort of actors that have been used to mobilize ethnic Russians to either start conflicts that then become frozen, or to lay the ground for things like the annexation of Crimea. All these folks are active in Central Asia. They run information operations that claim that the United States is behind all terrorist groups, that the motivation for US involvement in Afghanistan, the motivation for creating terrorist groups is that somehow the US makes money off of these. They reverse victimization. The MH17 disaster, where Russian rockets shot down an airliner that killed 300 civilians, was actually an example of how Russia is a victim of international plots against it. This goes back to anti-gay propaganda. The US is the source of both ISIS and homosexual weddings, and is trying to force you into both things at once. This is about Ukraine, but could be used in any of this messaging. You could substitute a Central Asian figure in here anywhere. On the left-hand side, you have Western influence, which is men kissing, and Hitler, and drugs. And on the right-hand side, you have the pride of the Soviet Union, angels, homeland, victory, this sort of thing, technological progress, which is all sort of funny and looks absurd to us until we remember things like this, and remember that it's the Russian terms that get used in this. So this messaging is having an effect on the way that Central Asians discuss things that are happening in their own country. A lot of the messaging focuses on the Stalin period. They promise things like a reindustrialization of Kyrgyzstan. They use World War II imagery very frequently, and then of course the West and Western liberalism are fascists and Nazis. This is a great example of this. These are apparently liberal Nazis in Kazakhstan that these groups are going to protect us from. And I'll close by saying that these groups, the way that extremist groups behave on social media is very similar across the group, absolutely regardless of ideology. This data comes from a study that J.M. Berger and a guy named Strathern from Google did in 2013, when they examined Twitter posts by US white nationalists, so completely unrelated to any of this. What happens is they take mainstream material and then they turn to these alternative news sites that allow them to put the true meaning on the mainstream material and then bring in extremist sources, their own extremist ideology, in order to then reinterpret these events. So when an ISIS bomb attack happens in Iraq and is reported on BBC or on the Daily Mail, then they get an article from RT that reminds you that, well, wait, ISIS is actually a CIA puppet used by the United States, and then they pull their own ideology over to this. This is a way of creating these information silos that allow you to reinterpret anything. It's a way to cooperate together so that you can nullify any objective interpretation of world events and then reimagine it in a way that supports an extremist ideology. And it's very interesting that these arrows that I have highlighted here are all alternative or extremist websites where I see Central Asian Islamist extremists reference these sites and these same issues. So regardless of content or regardless of the ideology, they're able to use these anti-Western, anti-liberal conspiracy theories, the same conspiracy theories, in order to justify their ideology. So they have more in common, in a way, than you would guess. And all it takes, while these messages don't appeal to a very broad audience, sometimes all it takes is appealing to one. All it takes is equipping one person with the requisite ideology, or someone who already is angry and willing to commit an act of violence. So they may have actually very little effect on the public or over public understanding, but social media allows them to connect to so many people that if they miss with a million, they find one person who's willing to construct a bomb or strap a bomb to their chest or something like that and commit an act of violence. And then the media that they're consuming and that they're producing normalizes that violence even as it happens. And I'll end there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.